The Enchanted Forge. The kingdom of Ebon Hollow rested in a valley bordered by jagged mountains and ancient, brooding forests. Once a land of fertile fields and joyous festivals, it had fallen under a curse so deep that sunlight seemed hesitant to linger too long. The skies were ever clouded, and the wind carried whispers that made even the bravest knights clutch their swords tightly. The curse had begun 10 years ago, when the Witch of Duskridge appeared in a storm of shadow and flame. She cursed the royal family for their sins she never spoke aloud, and stole Prince Alaric, the kingdom's only heir, leaving behind a kingdom paralyzed by fear. King Edric, now bent with grief, had summoned warriors, scholars, and magicians from far and wide to retrieve his son. One by one, they marched into Duskridge and never returned. Rumors of the witch's lair, an ever-shifting fortress of shadow, only deepened the hopelessness. The people began to believe no mortal could stand against her, and despair settled like a weight upon the land. In a quiet village on the outskirts of the kingdom lived Oran, the blacksmith. He was a man of strong arms and few words, respected for his skill and feared for the sorrow that clung to him like soot. His forge burned bright long into the night, but he kept to himself, haunted by the memory of his wife, Freya, who had vanished into the forest years ago, claimed by the same curse that had befallen the prince. It was on a storm-racked night that Oran's fate shifted. The storm rattled the shutters of his forge, and the wind howled like a grieving ghost. Oran, his hammer striking sparks against steel, was about to douse the fire when a sudden knock echoed against his door. He opened it to find a cloaked figure, her face hidden, but her presence unsettling. "You are Oran, the smith," she said, her voice like dry leaves rustling. "I bring tidings of the prince." The mention of the prince made Oran's heart lurch, though he kept his expression still. "And who are you to bring such tidings?" "A friend to those who would break the curse," she replied. "The prince lives, but he is bound by magic deeper than the roots of the mountains. He can only be freed by a blade forged in the fire of eternity." Oran frowned, gripping the doorframe. "Eternity is a word for poets and dreamers. I am a man of iron and fire. What you ask is impossible." "Nothing is impossible," the woman said, her tone sharp as a blade. From beneath her cloak, she produced a rolled map and pressed it into his hands. "The Forge of Eternity lies within the volcanic heart of the Ashen Spire. No ordinary man can reach it. But if you have the courage to try, the blade you create will shatter the witch's magic." Before Oran could respond, the woman turned and walked into the night, her figure vanishing into the storm. He unrolled the map, its ink glowing faintly in the dim light of his forge. The path marked was treacherous, winding through the cursed darkwood and over mountains that had claimed the lives of many travelers. He sat by the forge's dimming fire, staring at the map and wrestling with doubt. The journey was folly. Every sensible part of him knew it. But in his heart stirred a spark of purpose he had not felt since Freya's disappearance. He had failed her once. He would not fail again. The prince was the kingdom's hope, and perhaps if he succeeded, Oran could finally lay his ghosts to rest. At dawn, he packed his tools, a sack of provisions, and a small amulet that had once belonged to Freya. With the map in hand, he left his forge behind, its fires cold for the first time in years. As he stepped beyond the village and into the dark, tangled paths of the forest, the whispers of the curse seemed to grow louder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. Yet Oran did not falter. Each step carried him closer to the Forge of Eternity, and closer to a confrontation with the witch who had stolen not only the prince but also the light from his world. The forest known as the Darkwood was a place of legend and dread, a labyrinth of twisting paths and gnarled trees, whose roots seemed to claw their way out of the earth. Oran followed the glowing map, its lines shifting and shimmering like veins of molten metal. With each step, the air grew heavier, the light dimmer, as though the forest itself sought to snuff out hope. The first challenge came swiftly. As Oran navigated a narrow trail bordered by thorny brambles, a melodic laughter floated through the air. From the shadows emerged a group of fae, beings of radiant beauty, but with eyes that gleamed with malice. Their delicate wings shimmered like morning dew, and their smiles were as sharp as blades. "A mortal walks our path," one of them cooed, circling him like a predator stalking prey. "What brings you here, O iron-handed smith?" "I seek the Forge of Eternity," Oran replied, gripping the hilt of his hammer. "Stand aside." The fae burst into peals of laughter. "The Forge of Eternity is not for mortals," another said, her voice like a chime. "Turn back, or leave a token of your courage for us to remember you by." Oran scowled, knowing their kind thrived on trickery. "If you stand in my way, I'll give you a token you'll not forget," he growled, raising his hammer. The fae hissed, their mirth replaced by fury. "Iron!" one shrieked, recoiling. "Foul, hateful iron!" With a flash, they vanished into the trees, their laughter echoing faintly. Oran's heart pounded, but he pressed on, knowing he had much farther to go. The map led him next to the shifting sands, a barren expanse of dunes that seemed to ripple like water under the moonlight. As Oran trudged through the desert, the heat bore down on him, and his water skin ran dry. He felt the first tugs of despair when a figure appeared in the distance, a man with a lute slung over his shoulder, walking with an air of unshakable ease. "You seem lost," the man said, his voice carrying a note of amusement. He was tall and wiry, with a sharp jaw and eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Eldrin?" wandering bard and seeker of stories, at your service. And who might you be? Oran, a blacksmith, he said simply. He gestured to the map. I follow this to the Forge of Eternity. Eldrin's brows lifted. A blacksmith seeking the Forge of Legends? Now that's a tale worth singing. Mind if I join you? The sands are no place for a lone traveller. Oran hesitated but saw no malice in the bard's gaze. He nodded and the two began their trek together. Eldrin proved a useful companion, sharing stories of the cursed land and its secrets. He spoke of Duskridge and the witch, of warriors who failed, and the price of meddling with magic. You know, Eldrin said as they reached the edge of the desert, the Forge of Eternity isn't just a place. It tests those who dare approach. Are you ready for that, Smith? I'll do what I must, Oran replied, his tone resolute. Their journey took them next to a wide river shrouded in mist. As they approached the water's edge, a small boat emerged from the fog, piloted by a skeletal figure in a hooded robe. The ferryman. No crossing without payment, the ferryman rasped, his voice like rusted iron grinding. What will you give? Oran frowned, reaching for a coin, but Eldrin stopped him. Not gold, the bard whispered. He demands something of value to your soul. Understanding, Oran removed the amulet he had carried since Freya's disappearance. The thought of parting with it sent a pang through his chest, but he placed it in the ferryman's outstretched hand. The skeletal fingers closed over it, and the ferryman gestured for them to board. As they crossed, the fog grew thicker, and Oran heard whispers, ghostly voices calling his name. He gritted his teeth and ignored them, clutching his hammer tightly. Eldrin hummed a tune under his breath, his song cutting through the oppressive air. When they reached the far shore, the ferryman said nothing, only pointed to a distant peak wreathed in smoke. The ashen spire, the final stretch to the forge, was the most grueling. The mountain trail was steep and littered with jagged rocks. Sulphurous fumes burned Oran's lungs, and his muscles screamed with every step. Eldrin's cheer faded, replaced by a grim silence as they neared their destination. At last, they stood before the Forge of Eternity, hidden within a cavern that glowed with the light of molten fire. The air thrummed with ancient power, and Oran felt a shiver run through him. "You've made it this far," Eldrin said, his voice quiet. "But this is where I leave you. The Forge's magic is not for the likes of me." Oran nodded, his jaw set. "Thank you for guiding me." Eldrin gave a wry smile. "Just don't die, Smith. I'd hate to lose the ending to such a fine tale." With that, Oran stepped into the forge, the heat enveloping him like a living thing. He knew the real test was only beginning. The cavern housing the Forge of Eternity was unlike anything Oran had imagined. It was vast and alive, its walls shimmering with veins of molten ore that pulsed like the lifeblood of the earth. At the center, a pool of liquid fire roared with unnatural brilliance, its glow casting flickering shadows that danced across ancient carvings etched into the stone. The air hummed with a deep, resonant energy, as though the forge itself awaited his arrival. Oran stepped forward, the heat pressing against his skin like a living thing. The firelight revealed towering statues carved into the walls, their faces stern and watchful. Each held a hammer, their stony gazes fixed on the forge as if guarding its secrets. A shiver of awe ran through him. This was no ordinary forge. This was a place where gods and mortals once converged, where creations were birthed not from iron alone, but from the very essence of the soul. "You have come far, mortal." The voice rang out, echoing through the cavern like the toll of a great bell. From the shadows emerged a figure draped in flowing robes of ash and ember. Her eyes gleamed like molten gold, and her presence radiated both authority and otherworldly power. She was Sarah, the guardian of the forge. "You seek to craft a weapon to defy the Witch of Duskridge," she continued, her voice both questioning and knowing. "But the forge does not yield its power lightly." "I will do whatever is required," Oran said, his voice steady despite the weight of her gaze. He clutched the map, now blank, as though it had burned its purpose into his memory. Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile. Bold words, but the forge does not test your will alone. It tests your very essence. What you forge here will carry the truth of who you are. Should you falter, it will destroy you. Oran met her gaze, the image of Freya's face, and the thought of the prince imprisoned burning in his mind. "I have no choice." Sarah gestured toward the pool of fire, its light flaring as if in recognition. "Then let the trial begin." Oran approached the pool, and the tools of his craft seemed to appear from the very air. Tongs, a hammer, and an anvil shaped from dark stone that shimmered with an inner light. As his hands closed around the hammer, a sharp pain shot through him. He gasped, watching as glowing lines traced up his arms, connecting him to the forge. The fire roared, and the cavern filled with a sound like 1,000 hammers striking in unison. His task began. Drawing molten metal from the pool, Oran hammered it onto the anvil. Sparks flew like stars, each strike echoing with a resonance that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of the cavern. But with every blow, visions began to form in the flames. Visions of his past. The first was of Freya, her laughter ringing out as they worked side by side in the forge they had once shared. Then the scene shifted to the day she vanished, her footsteps disappearing into the darkwood as he stood helpless. The vision twisted, and now it was the prince, a boy trapped in a cage of shadows, reaching out to him. "Save me," the prince's voice whispered, but Oran's hammer faltered as the fire showed his own face, staring back with hollow eyes. The heat surged, and a voice, soft yet firm, whispered through his mind. Why do you fight? For glory? For guilt? Or for something greater? I fight to save what remains, Oran growled, his voice thick with emotion. I fight to make right what was lost. The fire seemed to approve, its glow shifting to a deep, vibrant gold. Oran hammered on, his strikes ringing with renewed determination. The blade began to take shape, its edges sharp and flawless, its surface engraved with runes that seemed to etch themselves into the steel. Sarah's voice broke through the haze. The weapon nears completion, but one final test remains. The forge demands a piece of your soul. Will you give it freely? Oran hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He looked at the blade, a thing of beauty and power, but also a reminder of what it would cost. He thought of Freya, the prince, and the kingdom waiting in darkness. His resolve hardened. I will give what is needed. He placed his hands on the blade, and a searing pain shot through him as the forge drew from his very essence. Memories of laughter and love, of despair and loss, flooded him, but he did not let go. The blade pulsed with light, absorbing his sacrifice, and then the cavern fell silent. Oran staggered back, his body weakened, but his heart steady. The weapon was complete, a sword ablaze with an inner fire, its runes glowing like embers. Sarah stepped forward, her expression unreadable. You have forged soul fire, she said. A weapon born of your strength and pain. Wield it wisely, for it carries the truth of who you are. Oran nodded, cradling the blade in his hands. It was warm, alive, and it hummed with a power that seemed to resonate with his very heartbeat. The forge dimmed, and Sarah's form began to fade. Go, blacksmith, she said, her voice echoing one last time. The fate of Ebon Hollow now rests in your hands. With Soulfire in his grasp, Oran turned toward the cavern's exit, the weight of his quest heavier than ever, but his resolve unbroken. The Witch of Duskridge awaited, and he would face her with all that he had. The journey back through the Ashen Spire was a battle in itself. The mountain seemed determined to keep Oran from leaving, as if the Forge of Eternity resented losing its creation. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the air crackled with energy. Yet Soulfire, the blade Oran had forged at such great cost, seemed to guide him. Its glow lit the treacherous path, and its warmth steadied his weary heart. When he emerged from the mountain, the world beyond seemed darker than before. The cursed land stretched endlessly before him, but Oran pressed forward, his every step driven by the knowledge of what lay ahead. The Witch of Duskridge awaited him, and he would not falter. The witch's lair, a fortress of twisted stone and shadow, loomed on the horizon like a wound upon the earth. As Oran approached, the air grew colder, and the land around him seemed to writhe with unnatural life. Eldrin rejoined him at the base of the fortress, his lute slung across his back and a grim look on his face. "You look like a man who's walked through the fires of creation," the bard said, his voice quieter than usual. "I have," Oran replied, his gaze fixed on the fortress. "And I'll walk through them again if that's what it takes." Eldrin nodded, his usual jesting demeanor replaced by solemnity. "Then let's not waste time. The witch won't greet us with open arms." Together, they crossed the threshold into the witch's domain. The fortress was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and spiraling staircases, its architecture seeming to defy reason. The walls pulsed as if alive, and the air carried a faint, eerie hum. It wasn't long before the first of the witch's creations appeared. A monstrous amalgamation of flesh and stone that lumbered towards them with unnatural speed. Oran raised Soulfire, its blade flaring with light, and met the creature head-on. The blade cut through its stony hide like a plough through soft earth, its enchanted runes glowing brighter with each strike. "You've made quite the weapon," Eldrin said, as he picked off smaller foes with his bow, his tone almost admiring. "Let's hope it's enough." The deeper they ventured, the more the fortress resisted. Traps sprung from the walls, spewing torrents of fire or razor-sharp spikes. Hallways twisted upon themselves, forcing Oran and Eldrin to retrace their steps more than once. And always, the shadows seemed to watch, whispering words of doubt and fear. "Do you hear them?" Eldrin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously to the shifting darkness. "They speak of failure, of betrayal." "They lie," Oran said firmly, gripping Soulfire tighter. "That's all they can do. Keep moving." The whispers grew louder the closer they came to the heart of the fortress. They spoke in Freya's voice, in the prince's voice, in Oran's own voice, each word calculated to unnerve him. But with every step, Oran reminded himself of the lives depending on him, and he let the whispers wash over him without sinking in. At last, they reached the final chamber. The great iron doors creaked open of their own accord, revealing a vast hall draped in shadow. At its center stood a figure cloaked in darkness, the Witch of Duskridge. She was both terrible and mesmerizing, her form shifting between a beautiful woman and a monstrous spectre. Her eyes glowed with malice, and her voice carried the weight of centuries. "So," she said, her tone laced with mockery, "another would-be hero comes to challenge me. Tell me, Smith, what do you think you can achieve where so many others have failed?" Oran stepped forward, Soulfire blazing in his hand. "I'm not here for glory. I'm here to end this curse and free the prince." The witch laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Bold words, but you cannot defeat me. I am the shadow that has grown from your kingdom's sins. I am vengeance incarnate." She raised her hands, and the shadows in the room coalesced into forms. Knights, monsters and wraiths, all surging toward Oran and Eldrin. Oran met them head-on, soulfire cutting through the dark constructs like a sun piercing a storm. Each swing of the blade burned with purpose, the runes glowing brighter as they absorbed the shadows. Beside him, Eldrin moved with surprising grace, his arrows striking true even as the enemy pressed closer. But the witch herself was untouchable, her form dissolving into smoke whenever Oran tried to approach. Her voice echoed around the hall. "You cannot defeat me, Smith. I am more than flesh. I am the curse itself." Oran gritted his teeth, a realization dawning. The witch was not just a foe to be slain. She was bound to the land's pain and sorrow. To end her, he would need more than Soulfire's strength. He would need to confront the truth of her existence. "Eldrin!" Oran shouted. "Hold them off!" The bard nodded, loosing arrows with renewed determination as Oran turned his full attention to the witch. He focused his will into Soulfire, its blade blazing brighter than ever before. As he stepped toward the witch, the shadows around her recoiled, and her form solidified. "You think your little light can destroy me?" she hissed. "No," Oran said, his voice calm. "But it can reveal you." He plunged Soulfire into the ground, the blade releasing a wave of light that illuminated the entire chamber. The witch screamed as the shadows peeled away, leaving her true form exposed. A woman, broken and weary, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. The battle was not yet over, but the tide had turned. The light from Soulfire bathed the chamber in a warm, golden glow, chasing away every shadow. The Witch of Duskridge, once cloaked in impenetrable darkness, now stood exposed. Her form, no longer shifting and spectral, was that of a weary woman draped in tattered robes. Her skin, pale as ash, was lined with cracks like worn porcelain, and her eyes, once blazing with malice, now flickered with a strange mixture of rage and sorrow. Oran held Soulfire before him, its runes pulsing steadily. "You are no longer hidden," he said, his voice resolute. "This ends now." The witch staggered, her hands clutching at the air as though trying to summon the shadows that had deserted her. "You think you've won, blacksmith?" she spat, though her voice trembled. "I am not merely a woman. I am the vengeance of this land. The sins of your kingdom gave me life. Do you think a blade can cut through that?" "I don't care what you were born from," Oran said, stepping closer. "You've taken enough. Enough lives, enough hope. The curse ends here." The witch let out a bitter laugh, but there was a tremor of fear in it. She raised her arms and the chamber shook. The ground beneath Oran's feet cracked, and fissures spewed black flames that licked hungrily toward him. From the fissures rose twisted spectres, remnants of the souls who had fallen to the curse. Their wails filled the air, but Oran stood firm, Soulfire blazing in defiance. "Do you see?" the witch cried, her voice rising to a scream. They are the voices of the damned. They are my strength. I will not fall to you. Oran gritted his teeth and raised Soulfire high. The blade's light intensified, cutting through the darkness and forcing the spectres to retreat. He knew the witch's power came not from the shadows themselves, but from the pain and grief they carried. To defeat her, he would have to confront that pain and refuse to let it break him. As the witch hurled more dark magic toward him, Oran advanced. Each step was heavier than the last, as if the very air around him sought to pull him down. Memories surged in his mind. Freya's laughter, her disappearance, the guilt he had carried for years. But with each memory, he gripped Soulfire tighter, the blade's warmth anchoring him. "You think I don't know grief?" Oran shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "I've lived with it every day. But grief doesn't have to consume us. It doesn't have to turn us into monsters." The witch faltered, her expression shifting from fury to something more fragile. For a moment, she looked like the healer she had once been, before the curse had claimed her. "You speak of what you don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I was made into this. I was forced into this." "Then let it end," Oran said, lowering his blade slightly. "The vengeance you've clung to, it's only caused more pain. Let it end, and let the land heal." The witch stared at him, the cracks on her skin deepening as her magic faltered. "And what of me?" she whispered. "If I let go, what remains of me?" Oran hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know this curse will destroy you if you don't. You've carried it long enough. Let the burden go." For a long moment, the chamber was silent, save for the flickering of Soulfire. The witch lowered her hands, the black flames around her sputtering and fading. Tears, molten and glowing faintly, rolled down her cheeks as she looked at Oran. "I cannot undo what I've done," she said, her voice a whisper. "But perhaps I can stop it from consuming more." She raised her hands once more, but this time she pressed them to her chest. Her body began to glow, and the darkness that had clung to her form broke away like shards of glass. The shadows writhed and screamed, but they dissolved into the air, leaving only light behind. The fortress trembled, its walls crumbling as the curse unraveled. Oran stumbled back as the ground beneath him cracked, but he held on to Soulfire, its light steady. The witch's form grew brighter, until she was no longer a woman, but a figure of pure, radiant energy. With a final mournful look at Oran, she whispered, "Thank you," and disappeared in a burst of light. The collapse of the fortress was deafening. Oran barely had time to shield himself before the world around him gave way. When the dust cleared, he found himself lying in a field of soft grass. The sky above him clear and bright for the first time in years. Soulfire lay beside him, its glow dim but steady. Eldrin appeared, dusting himself off. "Well," the bard said with a wry smile, "you've done it, smith. The curse is broken." Oran sat up, his body aching but his heart strangely light. "And the prince?" Eldrin gestured to a figure nearby. Prince Alaric, freed from his crystalline prison, stood with wide eyes, taking in the restored land around him. He turned to Oran, his expression one of gratitude and wonder. "You saved us," the prince said. "You saved everything." Oran nodded but said nothing. The weight of his journey settled over him, and he knew his task was complete. The land would heal, the prince would reign, and Ebon Hollow would thrive once more. As the kingdom celebrated the end of the curse, Oran returned to his forge. He placed soulfire in a hidden alcove, knowing its power was not meant for ordinary hands, though his body bore the scars of his journey. His heart was lighter, and his forge burned brighter than ever before. And so, the tale of the blacksmith who faced the shadows and forged a weapon of legend passed into myth. A story of courage, sacrifice, and the power of light to banish even the deepest darkness.